Welcome everybody to this episode of Freedom Hub's Working Group. I'm your host, Jeff Cantor, along with my co-host, Charles Froman. We do want to remind everybody we're sponsored by the Marketplace for Health, Wealth, and Freedom, and we'll take a detour over there. And the key is that we are the disruptors intersection. We're trying to make sure that everybody needs to be aware of these issues as well as drawing others so they can collaborate. And in that note, we are recording these for posterity, but here we go. I'm sorry. And we also have a separate show. So we're putting the link up here because it's for health issues and it's important. And again, these are the two domains that take you to the exact same place. But let's take a fast detour before we dig into today. So when you come to the main site, you will see there's a lot of great stuff to explore in the drop downs, but pertinent to what we're doing here today. If you click on the webinars page, you will get to see what's going on, and we'll come back to this. But then most importantly, the continuing the conversation, because today's talk is enough to get you started, but what are you going to do next? And that's where you're going to want to continue the conversation. So that's where we're going to let you get on board with these people. And here's was one of them. We were actually looking at one of them, but this gives you the chance to connect with all these people from past episodes and start to communicate with them or collaborate with them or donate or whatever's pertinent. And there's a lot of very important stuff. And in that vein, we also have people that are out there fighting for our freedom. So under the freedom tab, fighting for freedom, when you click over there, couple things are happening here. One, we're curating all of the most important issues and action items that you need to pretty much tap on all these and help participate. And then these are different groups and organizations that are working towards our freedom that you need to be aware of, and some of them might hit your hot button, and it's a way for you to connect with them in a different way. But let's kick back to the webinar part. And at the top of the page, there's some good information about it, but then it immediately shows you the two talks that we conduct, explains about who they are, gives you a chance to register if you're not already permanently registered, a little chance to see who's coming next so you can plan your calendar. And then very importantly, the links to see the videos, because these are always released over the weekend. So by Monday morning on any of these 4 channels, you'll catch this particular show. So if we were to click on this one here as an example, it would bring us over here where you'll see a wealth of shows, and all of these people are tied to that continuing the conversation aspect. And in that other event I was describing that we do the evening one that's about the cash patients and cash doctors and escaping the stranglehold of insurance and all of what that brings, there's a whole battery of people and events over here to take a look at. So there's a lot to explore here, which is fantastic. But let's see what we're talking about today. So hold on a second. Let me get back up to the area here. And here we are. And now I'm going to let Charles kind of jump in here and give us a little rundown.
Gladly, Jeff, and welcome, Scott. When I was a Republican congressional staffer in the 90s, I became a libertarian just seeing how corrupt DC was. And I got into the deep thinkers, including Rothbard, which led me to a biography of him by Justin Raimondo. And reading Justin, I saw he was prolific at this site, antiwar.com. Well, unfortunately, Justin passed away, and the face of antiwar.com now is Scott Horton. And Scott's background stems in part from the Ron Paul movement, where he was quite active. And Scott also has founded with some others the Libertarian Institute. And he's authored several books, including Fool's Errand, Time to Get Out of Afghanistan. And he's got a brand new book on ending the war on terrorism. And there you see it right there. This talk is about, stopping the intervention overseas. And of course, it's now become timely because the Boulder shooter apparently responded to discrimination against himself and his people that he couldn't take. And he became depressed and a bit crazy and unleashed his anger in a fuselage of gunfire. But the terrorism war, as scientists have said, it does lead to more discrimination against Middle Easterners. And as we've had, Danny Shorson speak on this event, and we've also had Karen Stewart, it has repercussions domestically too, with the growing police state, which is now targeting dissidents. This is a terrible war we need to end, and we have the perfect person today, Jeff, to speak about that.
Fantastic. Well, Scott, I'm going to pull off the site here and let you become the featured guest.
Okay, great. Everybody see and hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, great. Well, thank you all very much for having me here. both of you and Jeff and Charles, and to the entire audience. I'm very happy to make y'all's acquaintance and appreciate the opportunity to share what I have to say here. So as you said, the new book is called Enough Already: Time to End the War on Terrorism. And essentially it's all of the Middle East wars, America's Middle East wars, from Jimmy Carter through Donald Trump. And this thing's straight here. And so as you could tell right there, just in the introductory description there, the book doesn't start in 2001. It starts in 1979. And that is because the truth is our government got us into this mess with the terrorists in the first place. And then they lied about the motivation of the terrorists and why they attacked us, and used those misrepresentations to launch 20 years of war against people who did not attack us and had nothing to do with the attack on this country, but essentially to serve other agendas, and corrupt ones and foreign ones. And so, the title, Enough Already: Time to End the War on Terrorism, is in a sense misleading. That's just the last few pages. The book is really an alternative history of what's happened here. And by that, I don't mean that I reveal a bunch of secret operations you've never heard of before and that kind of thing. Most of this is pretty conventional history that's been told in other places. It's a synthesis by me. There's very little original reporting in it. There's some, but essentially it's just me trying to put it together for you in a way. And so, for example, everybody and their dad knows that Ronald Reagan backed Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, right? So I try to help put that in context. What came before that? What came after that? What was the reason for it? And who cares now? What difference does it make to us today? And try to draw the line through. And so the story begins in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. Really, that means it began in 53 when the CIA installed the Shah, really reinstalled the Shah Reza Pahlavi, the dictator of Iran. And he ruled that country for 26 years with support from the Americans and the Israelis. And then in 1979, when he was sick and dying of cancer, his regime essentially fell apart and a widespread popular revolution broke out. Now, you might even have seen, I remember being confused by this when I was first learning this story as a kid. When it happened, I was too young, but still I learned about it in the 1980s when I was still very young. It seems strange to me that the French, our allies, put the Ayatollah Khomeini on a plane to send him back to Iran to cause all this trouble for us. Why would they do that? That's our longest alliance we've had in the world, is with the French, right? Well, of course, the answer is that the Americans told them to do so. The CIA and the State Department had encouraged Jimmy Carter to go ahead and let the Ayatollah come back because we know this guy. He's an old friend of ours. His group helped us soften up Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister, for the coup back in 53. So we can work with him. One State Department official even compared him to Mahatma Gandhi. And they said this will be fine. And in fact, America kept a working relationship with Iran after the revolution, which was in February, really late 78, and then really culminating in February of 1979. And they continued to pass intelligence to the Iranians, for example, about threats from the Soviet Union, about working together on common goals in Afghanistan, and actually even about threats from Iraq's new dictator, Saddam Hussein, who also came to power in a coup not in a revolution, but in a bloody coup d'etat in 1979. And he had worked for the CIA on and off since 1958. But this is when he finally seized power, was also in 79. But you might be confused by that, because what about the hostage crisis? I thought the Iranian Revolution meant permanent enmity between America and Iran. You're right about that, but you're wrong about the date. Popular memory always conflates these things together. But the hostage crisis didn't happen until November, 10 months later, when Jimmy Carter let the Shah into the United States for cancer treatment. And that was taken as a sign by the students and others in Tehran that America was going to try to do another coup and cancel the revolution and reinstall the dictatorship. And that, not to justify it, but that's what happened. But so for that year, that almost entire year, the Carter government had continued to work with them. And speaking of working with them in Afghanistan, in 1979, the same year in the summer, in July, on July 3rd, Jimmy Carter signed a finding that's an order to the CIA to begin covert action in Afghanistan to support the Mujahideen for the express purpose of trying to provoke the Soviet Union into invading Afghanistan. Now, that might sound crazy because, of course, the Cold War policy was containment, right? But no, after Vietnam, which was such a disaster and was widely regarded as a no-win quagmire, decade-long mess that we should have never got into, that broke the bank and divided the society back home, and was a massive self-inflicted wound, as well as all of the destruction that had rained down on the people of Southeast Asia, of course. So the American people had what our government considered a mental illness, the Vietnam syndrome, which said we didn't want to contain communism anymore if we had to do more Koreas and Vietnams. We're over it now. We're done with this. So some of the strategic thinkers in the Carter government said, you know what we could do? What if instead of containing communism, we bait them into overexpansion? And so we'll give them their own Vietnam. And let's start out in Afghanistan. And that was their words at the time. We'll give them their own Vietnam. So that was why they started backing the Mujahideen there. Now, the Soviets invaded in December of 1979, and it should be noted that it wasn't really in response to the American support for the Mujahideen, which at that point was somewhat minimal, and I don't know if it had made much difference. But the reason the Soviets invaded was because their own communist sock puppet dictator was tearing the country apart in civil war. And the first thing they did was the KGB took him out back and shot him in the head and replaced him with a new guy. So that was, you know, they really were invading to shore up their own regime, which had plenty of its own problems, many of them self-inflicted as well. So, not to coin a phrase there. So then, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that the Carter government had deliberately provoked, although that was a secret at the time, the American people didn't know that, they panicked and said, oh no, now the Soviets, what if they invaded Iran next? They could dominate the Persian Gulf and global oil supplies. And so we can't have that. So Jimmy Carter announced the Carter Doctrine of permanent American expansion in the Persian Gulf. And that meant it was in the State of the Union address of 1980. He said that the Persian Gulf is an American lake and that any attempt by any other power, read the Soviet Union, to dominate the Persian Gulf would be treated as an attack on the United States of America. In other words, would mean full-scale war. And then as part of that doctrine, they expanded American bases in Saudi, Qatar, Bahrain, and United Arab Emirates, especially in Saudi Arabia. And Jimmy Carter also gave the green light to Saddam Hussein to go ahead and proceed with his invasion of Iran. And so then the Ronald Reagan government, when they came in 1981, they continued all of these policies, including supporting the Iraqi side in the Iran-Iraq war, although they also sold weapons to the Ayatollah in the what's now known as the Iran-Contra scandal. And it was really the Israelis who were selling weapons to the Iranians while the Americans were selling weapons to the Iraqis all through that time. And they also continued support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the war against the Soviets, including working with the Saudis and the Pakistanis to send tens of thousands of foreign fighters from North Africa, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and as far as Indonesia and even the United States of America to go and fight. They were mostly referred to as the Arab Afghan Army. And yes, of course, this included Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri and the future leaders of Al-Qaeda who had gone to fight there in that war. Okay. So then at the end, oh, and I should explain, sorry, I skipped this. When Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, he had a very real reason to do so. The problem was that he was sitting on a minority, 20% minority Sunni dictatorship over the supermajority Shiite population of the country, 60%. And then another 20% are the Kurds in the far north in the mountains there. Now they're predominantly Sunnis, but they're a different ethnicity and we're very much on the outs. In 2003, once America invaded, they had their alliance with the Shia, not with the Sunni Arabs. So anyway, Hussein had and they were oftentimes close to Iran themselves. But Hussein had a real problem with the Iraqi Shiite supermajority in the Iranian Revolution. They had three major identities, right? Shiite, Arab, and Iraqi. Of course, the Iranians are Persian, a different ethnicity, but Shiite Islam was born in Iraq and had traveled west into Iran, into Persia back a millennia ago. But all the major holy sites and everything are in Iraq. That's where the tradition springs from in the first place. And so Hussein was worried that the Iraqi Shiites, or some substantial number of them, would choose their religious sect over their ethnic Arab and national Iraqi sect, and which was true. Some Iraqi Shiites immediately went across the border to Iran to help join the revolution and took Iran's side. And so what Hussein did was panic and conscripted them all and sent them to war. And he thought it would be easy. He thought they'd march right to Tehran and destroy the new revolutionary government and all would be well. That didn't work out. Instead, it was an 8-year stalemate, World War I type slaughter, with including American support for Hussein's use of chemical weapons against the Iranians, sarin and Tabun nerve gas, and the worst chemical warfare since World War I. And then something like 500,000 people died on each side of that war. Then in 1990, famously, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in a dispute over war debts. And at the time, they never really made any of this clear to the American people, what was going on at all. Oh, Saddam Hussein, yeah, he's the Middle Eastern Hitler, and he's trying to take over the whole world on this megalomaniacal, maniacal mission, and we have to stop him, and that's all you need to know about it. But the reality was that Hussein, in fighting that war against Iran, was also protecting the interests of the Saudis, especially, who all of their oil happens to sit under where their very small Shiite minority lives in the northeast of the country there, the nominal northeast. The whole country slanted to the northwest, but anyway. And also protecting the interests of the Kuwaitis and the United Arab Emirates and the rest of the Arabian Peninsula, at least they thought. And they had taken out massive loans and received lots of support from the Gulf states, from the Sunni kingdoms of Arabia, in order to help them fight the war against revolutionary Shiite Iran. Well, then at the end of the war, the Kuwaitis came demanding payment. But the problem was oil was trading at about $10 a barrel, and Hussein's government could not rebuild the country or even begin to pay off their war debts. And they were trying to negotiate, and the Kuwaitis wouldn't negotiate. And I make the case in the book that if you want to, I think it's fair to be Occam's razor about. It doesn't look like they deliberately entrapped Hussein into invading Kuwait just to attack him. But in effect, that's what happened, because the CIA and Central Command were telling the Kuwaitis, oh, tell Hussein to go to hell and, treat him badly. Don't show up. Don't worry about him. We've got your back and all this stuff. At the same time, the State Department under James Baker was telling Saddam Hussein, yeah, you want to invade their northern oil fields? And I left out one of the major complaints was the Kuwaitis were overproducing from the shared oil wells in the Rumaila oil field on the border region there. And James Baker's State Department, this is under President Bush Sr. now, who had been Reagan's vice president, had essentially told him, man, you want to invade the northern oil fields? No problem. Ambassador Glaspie later told the New York Times, well, nobody thought he was going to invade the whole country. It's the northern oil fields. Well, then what happened was on August 2nd, 1990, invaded the whole country. But then when the National Security Council met, they drew the line at Saudi Arabia. Colin Powell, Brent Scowcroft, Dick Cheney, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time, and George Bush Sr. signed off on this. We don't care about Kuwait. We're just drawing a line at Saudi. Don't you even think about invading Saudi, man, or we'll bomb you. But other than that, we don't care. But then the next day, Margaret Thatcher insulted Bush's masculinity and said, well, you're not going to go wobbly on this now, are you, Bush, at a conference in Aspen, Colorado? And so he said, no, this will not stand. And all this. He had already had, as the comedian Bill Hicks pointed out, he had the reputation of the wimp president. And so this, he really had to prove himself, and this was his chance to let some blood. And so he spent the rest of 1990 refusing to negotiate with Saddam Hussein, who had been his client as recently as a couple of months before. And in the Iraqgate scandal that came out, it was shown that they were selling weapons to Iraq right up until the moment that they invaded Kuwait, and apparently some even after, during the buildup for Desert Shield and the war. Then everybody knows that Iraq War I was great. Operation Yellow Ribbon, the 100-hour war. And it was quick and it was easy and it was painless. And there was no canopy covered Ho Chi Minh Trail and all these frustrations. Just our armored divisions rolled in there and blasted theirs in almost completely one-sided campaigns, and what a roaring success. And Bush Sr. said, by God, we've beat the Vietnam syndrome once and for all. The Soviet Union was falling apart, largely as a result, or at least in part as a result of their overextension in the war in Afghanistan, and they were no longer in our way. And the Americans decided that they were going to expand their footprint in the Middle East and stay. What happened was, and this got a lot less attention, it's relatively well known, but not nearly as well known as Iraq War I, and that is the Shiite and Kurdish uprising against Saddam Hussein that happened in 4 to 6 weeks after the end of Iraq War I. And what happened was Bush Sr. had encouraged them to rise up, had the Air Force drop leaflets, and had put out a message over Voice of America, encouraging them to rise up. Now's their chance to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And America occupied the entire south of the country at the time. So the implication clearly was, we'll support you. But instead, the Bush Sr. government changed their mind and betrayed the Shiite uprising and Kurdish uprising, and allowed Saddam Hussein to keep enough tanks and attack helicopters to crush the insurrection, and stood back and watched him do it. And as many as 100,000 people were killed in this massive Bay of Pigs type debacle. Now, why? Well, the answer, of course, is that they realized that those Iraqi Shiites who had taken Iran's side in the Iran-Iraq War when it broke out in 1980, now here they were 11 years later coming back across the border to help lead the Shiite revolution against Saddam Hussein, namely the Supreme Islamic Council and their Badr Brigade militia were coming across to lead the revolution. And so the Bush government, which these were all men from the Reagan years, it was really the Reagan-Bush type 12-year administration there, massive continuity. Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had been Reagan's national security advisor. Bush, of course, his vice president. Baker, his chief of staff, et cetera. And they said, oh my God, what are we doing? We're reversing our decade-long policy of supporting Saddam Hussein to contain the Iranian Revolution. Now we're importing it into Iraq. And so they choked and called it off and let Hussein slaughter them all. But then they said, well, now we have to stay to protect the Iraqi Shiite that we just set up and then betrayed, which of course was a phony excuse anyway, because the insurrection had been put down. It's like Saddam Hussein was just going to keep killing them and killing them and killing them until they were all dead. He was just crushing the insurrection, which he had already succeeded in doing. But under the excuse of protecting the Shiites, they told the Saudi King Fahd, well, we have to stay. And so they kept the bases in Saudi Arabia, and they kept the sanctions regime. They never lifted any of the sanctions, which was a literal economic siege of Iraq by the entire world under United Nations Security Council resolutions. It was illegal for any nation or corporation to trade with Iraq, and the people starved to death. And there was an overblown study that said 500,000. It was later, estimated credibly that approximately 300,000, same difference, 300,000 children under 5 years old had died, who would, as excess deaths, who would otherwise not have died if it had not been for the sanctions regime enforced by the United States during that time. And Clinton's Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, famously told 60 Minutes, we think the price is worth it. And the Bush government and then the Bill Clinton government had announced that no matter what happens, weapons of mass destruction or not, we are keeping the sanctions until Saddam Hussein is removed from power. But that doesn't make any sense, right? That you put sanctions on the entire country, break the entire economy. And then as the people are getting sicker and weaker and poorer in relation and in comparison to their dictatorship, less able than ever before to mount any effective opposition against it, we're saying that only once you succeed in overthrowing your government for us will we lift the sanctions on you, which was an absolute absurdity and an atrocity based on an absolute absurdity. And it was this policy more than any other that turned Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan's Arab Afghan Mujahideen fighters that had gone to serve the US, Saudi, Pakistani Mujahideen cause in the 1980s against the United States of America. And bin Laden was kicked out of Saudi Arabia for denouncing the king, kowtowing to the United States on this. And then the other second, very important reason on the list, other than support for all these dictatorships, the military bases, the campaign against Iraq from Saudi, was American support for Israel and their occupation of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, as well as the brutal occupation of the Lebanese that was taking place at that time. And this was the major motivation. And this was said over and over and over again by the group that ended up becoming Al-Qaeda and then later by Al-Qaeda. So the Azam group of bin Laden, which is the Saudi-dominated faction, really, allied with and merged with Egyptian Islamic Jihad. And that's what we now call Al-Qaeda. And their first attack in the United States was against a radical Israeli rabbi named Rabbi Kahane, who was an expansionist who encouraged the policy of cleansing, as they call it, the West Bank of all of the rest of the Palestinians from historic Palestine and seizing all of the West Bank for the Israeli Jews. And the Israeli Supreme Court had outlawed his party and called it fascist and had disallowed him from even participating in Israeli politics. And he was assassinated in New York City in 1990. That was the first one. Then was the World Trade Center bombing and the failed attack plot against the Lincoln and Holland tunnels and the United Nations building. Then was the attack against the Americans training Saudi National Security Guard and National Guard forces in 1995. The Khobar Towers attack of 1996, which very importantly killed 19 American airmen stationed in Saudi for their missions against Iraq. And this was done by bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And the thing of it was that they blamed it on Iran. This wasn't right-wing religious radical extremists in Saudi Arabia who are showing us they really want us off of their land. This was the Iranians for no reason, apparently, no direct reason, just taking a target of opportunity across the Gulf. And that obscured the motive for the attack and the important lesson that could have been learned from that attack. Then, of course, was the Africa embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Nairobi, Kenya in 1998, and then the USS Cole in the year 2000, and a failed plot to attack LAX airport also in the year 2000, and then ultimately September 11th. Now, all throughout this time, these men made it clear what their motivation was for attacking us, and including the lead hijacker, Mohammed Atta, and his friend Ramzi bin al-Shibh, who's in Guantanamo to this day, who had helped to coordinate the attack. They were motivated by Israel's massacre of Lebanese in Operation Grapes of Wrath in 1996. And when bin Laden put out his first declaration of war, blaming Americans for Israeli actions in Lebanon, these Egyptian engineering students went and joined up their cause. And that might have been way too complicated for the American government to explain to the American people, I guess. So they just lied and said they hate us because we love our moms and apple pie and this kind of thing. They couldn't admit that it was all their fault. But see, it wasn't just that they were mad at us, they had a strategy. And unlike the strategy of the Khobar Towers attack, which you could probably attribute to the idea would be that America might wise up and close our bases and get out of Saudi Arabia. This isn't just their homeland. Think about how much we revere ours. But this is their holy land, the land of Mecca, Medina. This is like if Jesus had been born at the Alamo, right? Is how sacred of sites these are to these people. And we have our bases right adjacent to them with, foreign combat forces on the ground there. And they had made it very clear what this was about. Now, anyway, the point being, the Khobar Towers attack might have been meant to scare us away, but it didn't work. They blamed it on Iran, obfuscated the motive. And, it just, Bill Clinton and all of his scandals and all of these things obscured all of what was happening to the American people at the time. I should mention real quickly that Clinton's government backed the Mujahideen, the bin Ladenite terrorists in Bosnia, in Kosovo, and in Chechnya, as I document in the book for you too, while all of this is happening. But then the motive for September 11th, the motive was the occupations, et cetera. But the strategy was to goad America into overreacting, to essentially give Bush an opportunity to exploit. And I quote in the book from an interview that bin Laden's son gave to Rolling Stone magazine in 2010, saying his father, Osama bin Laden, was rooting for George W. Bush in 2000. He was so happy that Bush won. He didn't see a tough Texas, right-wing militarist who was going to deliver violence and, oh no, we better not make him mad. He saw the perfect mark that here is a fake Texas tough guy who's never really been in a fight in his life, but is corrupt and cynical and will exploit a crisis to the ends of the earth. Now, that sounds crazy, right? Except that, remember, that was Jimmy Carter's strategy for the Soviet Union. Give them an excuse to overextend, to drag them in, bog them down, bleed them to bankruptcy, and push them out of the region the long and the hard way. And that is what bin Laden is doing to us, giving us our own Afghanistan. As he said over and over again, as his son Omar told Rolling Stone, my father's strategy was to do to the Americans what he had done to the Russians with American help just 20 years before. And so that was the purpose for the September 11th attack, was to fool the American people, to give Bush and his government a cynical crisis to a crisis to exploit in their cynicism, but to fool the American people into going along with it through our fear. And then that's what happened. Bush did exactly what he wanted. And not only that, and I make the case in both books. The previous book is Fool's Errand. Maybe you can see behind me on the shelf there. Time to End the War in Afghanistan. And I have my receipts, especially in the first book there, that they let bin Laden go. They deliberately withheld Rangers, Green Berets, and Marines who all could have come to assist the Delta Force and the CIA at Tora Bora to kill bin Laden and prevent him from escaping. And after he escaped across the border into Pakistan, they pretended like he just jumped into hyperspace or something. There's no way in the world they could have chased him in Pakistan, even though Pakistan was a loyal, well, not so loyal, but an ally of the United States, somewhat loyal. I mean, they had supported the Taliban, but so had Bill Clinton's government just 5 years before, had worked with them to support the Taliban. So that's kind of not that bad. And they were already cooperating. Robert Grenier, the CIA station chief in Islamabad, wrote in his book, 88 Days to Kandahar, about how they were ready to cooperate with any American efforts to hunt down and kill the bin Ladenites who might be coming across the border. And Bush simply refused to allow them to do it. They needed that boogeyman. They needed to be able to tell your mom that Osama bin Laden is still out there somewhere. Who cares if Saddam Hussein has an alliance with Osama bin Laden if bin Laden's already dead and the American people are under the impression that the war is won, that we beat the bad guys, we got them, and now it's Christmas time and everything's okay. And in the book Bush at War by Bob Woodward, he quotes extensively, massive block quotes directly from the National Security Council minutes of the meetings taken by the official note takers in the Bush government, where Bush and Rumsfeld especially, but the rest of the Principals Committee to discuss at length, how do we make sure the American people understand that this war is a lot bigger than bin Laden? And if we don't get him, that's not failure. And if we do get him, that's not victory. And maybe we should start bombing Iraq right now, so that the American people know that this war is going to go on. This is not a war against Al-Qaeda. It's a war against terror, which could mean anything and was meant to. And so that was the way that they constructed it in the first place. And then Wesley Clark, who had been Bill Clinton's Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in the 1990s, has told the story now. He didn't have the moral courage to tell the story at the time, which would have been a huge scandal. He's a 4-star general. He had every ability to go on any channel he wanted and tell this story, but he waited until it was too late. But anyway, he said he went to the Pentagon shortly after September 11th, and a general called him into the room and said, you got to see this, or some officers called him into the room. General, you've got to see this, and showed him this memo that had been written by the neoconservatives in Donald Rumsfeld's office. And it was a plan for America to attack and regime change 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria and Lebanon, which I think that means Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and then Sudan, Somalia, Libya, and Iran. And who am I leaving out? Oh, Syria. Did I say Syria? Anyway, and the point being that none of these governments had participated in the September 11th attack against the United States. None of these governments had an alliance with Osama bin Laden. None of them. And nothing to do with it whatsoever. This is pure cynical exploitation. And then their first target was Saddam Hussein, the guy who wears a Western olive green military uniform with a French beret and a clean-shaven chin, a big Mayor Quimby sash, who clearly worships only himself, has never read a word of the Quran or the Hadiths in his life. Saddam Hussein, this guy is now a religious fundamentalist, terrorist extremist, bent on working with Osama bin Laden to attack the United States with chemical weapons so that what? We can drop an H bomb on Baghdad and be done with it? What a ridiculous set of lies that they used. And then here's the thing of it, right? And I know I'm supposed to be wrapping up here, and I'm only halfway through. But here's the thing. If America's invasion of Afghanistan to replicate the Soviet failure there was all bin Laden ever wanted, and the invasion of Iraq to depose the socialist infidel Saddam Hussein, as bin Laden called him, and create a massive sectarian war that continues to rage there to this day, 17 years later. If that was, as the former chief of the CIA's bin Laden unit, Michael Scheuer put it, the hoped for but unexpected gift to bin Laden, which did help to create and drive the ranks of bin Ladenite terrorists in the world from the low hundreds into the tens of thousands. If that was the hoped for but unexpected gift to bin Laden, then what do you call it when then Barack Obama went on to Libya to support the Libyan Islamic fighting group, Ansar al-Sharia and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in their war against the secular dictator Muammar Gaddafi, the first man to put out an Interpol warrant for Osama bin Laden back in 1996, the man who George W. Bush had brought in from the cold in 2003 and made a deal and made him a partner in the war on terrorism in a country that's now been at war for 10 years straight ever since, is still in the middle of a bloody civil war, and where for a time was the largest outpost of ISIS outside of the Levant in the middle part of the last decade in 2015 and 16. And then what do you call it when he goes on to wage this half regime change effort against Bashar al-Assad? Again, a guy who shaves his chin every morning, wears a three-piece suit, and was essentially a Western style secular fascist dictator who had inherited the power from his father, of course, but who ran a country, runs still to this day, a country that is supported, a government that is supported by every single ethnic and sectarian and religious minority in the country. And that is all of the Alawites, all of the Shiites, all of the Druze, and all of the Assyrian and Chaldean Christians and Maronite Christians, and a huge proportion, if not majority, I think probably majority, certainly huge plurality of Sunni Arabs as well, who are the majority population of the country. But like in a city like Aleppo, it was a pro-government city, even though it was almost almost entirely, it was predominantly Sunni Arab city, was pro-government. They're not a bunch of bin Ladenites and had nothing to do with a bunch of bin Ladenites, but the CIA did. And Barack Obama's government, in cooperation with the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, the Jordanians, and the Israelis, worked for years to funnel billions of dollars and literally hundreds of thousands of tons of weapons to these groups fighting against Bashar al-Assad, when from the very beginning, and it was known from April 2011 on, the Saudis are sending jihadist terrorists to Syria to fight. And you know who wrote that? Dick Cheney's man, John Hanna, at foreignpolicy.com. From the very beginning of the war, it was clear this is not a democratic revolution. This is a foreign invasion. And guess who? The bad guys from the last war. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the worst part of the Sunni insurgency. Al-Qaeda in Iraq that had never existed before the war, of course, that only came into existence in reaction to American support for the Shiite supermajority there. I should have mentioned that. When Bush Jr. invaded, he picked up where his father left off and put that Shiite revolution right in power in Baghdad, fought a 5-year sectarian war on their behalf there, and turned Baghdad into now an 85 to 90% Shiite city. And it was that drove the Sunni population out of power and into the arms of the bin Ladenites there in Iraq War II. And this is really why, this is explanation for why Obama supported Al-Qaeda in Syria. It's not because he's a secret Muslim from Kenya. It's because he's George W. Bush. He's trying to correct from his last mistake, essentially. We put Iran's best friends in power in Baghdad. So now we want to take Iran's friends out of power in Damascus, even if that means supporting Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in Syria. And then that led to the rise of the Islamic State Caliphate, which seized and consolidated power over eastern Syria in 2013, and then rolled into western Iraq and created the Caliphate a year later in June 2014, which then, of course, necessitated America launching Iraq War III, again on the side of the Shiite militias they wish they hadn't fought Iraq War II for, the Iranian-backed Shiite militias, as they're so widely known, in order to fight and destroy the Islamic State that they had built up in order to spite them in the first place. And then if you thought bin Laden loved that, then what about when Obama turned around after bombing Al-Qaeda for 6 years in Yemen? He turned around and took their side in 2015 and launched a war that is still going to this day, 6 years later, a war where America's on the side of Al-Qaeda, fighting against their enemies, the Houthis, who are friends with, nominally backed by Iran, but hardly the puppets of them. And so here America is not just turning the entire Middle East upside down in favor of all of this chaos and radicalism in religious and sectarian and political terms, but when they're not making Al-Qaeda more powerful by attacking them, they're making them much more powerful by outright taking their side against the American government and their allies, the Saudis and the Israelis and others, their primary regional rival, the Iranian Shiites, even though they didn't do September 11th. It's the bin Ladenites who are the butchers of New York City, people who attacked us for being too close to their governments, not agents of Iran, Iraq, or Syria, the axis of evil regimes. And then, so now America continues to occupy eastern Syria, even after the caliphate's been destroyed, continue to occupy eastern Syria and western Iraq, nominally in the name of fighting ISIS. And special operations forces in Iraq still go out against ISIS, and you call it Iraq War 3.5, that mopping up exercise. But if you listen closely to Donald Trump or Joe Biden or their officials, the reason we're there is because of the Shiites, not because of the bin Ladenites, but because of Iran. Because now there's what they call a land bridge, a road, a system of roads that goes from Tehran through Baghdad and through Damascus to Beirut. And so now, because of America's policies, Saddam Hussein and his Sunni minority dictatorship is no longer the roadblock in that chain. And so now America has to stand in the way. And so we keep our base at Al-Tanf in Syria and continue occupying the oil fields and the wheat fields and continue waging this massive sanctions campaign against Syria and Iran, both, all to try to make up for the fact that George Bush and his government gave Iran's friends Baghdad back in 2003 through 9, which is something that cannot be undone ever. It took the U.S. Army and Marine Corps 5 years to help the Shiite militias cleanse Baghdad of Sunni Arabs. It can't be reversed. And the Saudis can fling suicide bombers at Baghdad from now into eternity, and they will for the rest of our lifetimes. And our government will probably continue to use our side's own violence, these bin Ladenites, as the excuse to continue to confront their Shiite enemies. So now, here we are, 20 years into this thing, and the war in Yemen especially is, and I left out Somalia, it's just as bad as any of these, but it doesn't really link right into the chain the way the rest of them do, of all the cause and effect, but it's just as bad. Hundreds of thousands of civilians have been killed in the war in Somalia that Bush has waged there since 2001, and especially since 2006. And so at the end of all of this, we've lost approximately 7,000 soldiers. We spent something like $6.5 trillion. And not just that, but the opportunity cost of all of that money, if it had been invested properly, and all the opportunity cost of all of that, brain power and manpower, just absolutely blown in the sands of the Middle East, when all of that could have been, as bin Laden's son Omar put it, better spent for the Americans on their own economy. And what do we have to show for it? Biden announced today that he's breaking Trump's deal and extending the war in Afghanistan, leaving the troops there. And yet we all know that it doesn't matter if we leave a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or 20 more years from now, that America already lost the war in Afghanistan. We're right where we started, with the Taliban in power virtually in 2001. And after all of this, the American people have gotten absolutely nothing out of it whatsoever, other than complete economic devastation, the buildup of our Homeland Security state alongside of our national security state, and now as we can see right before our eyes, the turning of our government's counter extremism programs against the American people. Stanley McChrystal says it's time to break out our counterinsurgency doctrine against the American right over January 6th. And in fact, there was a really important interview on NPR News where Mike Flynn, wait, was it Flynn? No, I think it was McChrystal himself, made the comparison between, pardon me, I know who it was. It was Robert Grenier, who I meant, Grenier. It's spelled Grenier, but it's Grenier, French name. I can't do it. Anyway, he had been the CIA station chief in Islamabad, Pakistan at the dawn of the terror war. Okay. And he gave an interview to NPR News just a few weeks ago where there's actually a stunning admission. He says, when we invaded, our focus, was on Al-Qaeda, but more importantly, it was on the environment in which Al-Qaeda was thriving. And that meant the Taliban. Well, didn't he just confirm my accusation against him and his and the Bush government in my book, Fool's Errand, that they deliberately deprioritized Al-Qaeda, who did it, in favor of focusing on the Taliban, who did not. And then what does he say? He's citing this. That's just a side point. He's citing this as a successful model and saying what we're looking at with this handful of Alex Jones fans and QAnon idiots, people who don't even listen to regular right-wing radio, right? Who are just off in their own flat earth land or whatever. These kind of people had this one big, unarmed, almost entirely nonviolent event at the Capitol at the direct behest of the sitting president of the United States in this ridiculous one-off event that happened, and which I'm not saying he sent them into the building, but I'm just saying they wouldn't have been there and they wouldn't have moved toward the Capitol at all, except that he told them to. And otherwise, there's nothing to this. The QAnon movement in America is the most marginal thing in the world. They have no political power whatsoever, and they're a danger to political power in no way whatsoever in this country. The entire thing's overblown. But then Robert Grenier says, so this is what we need to do. If all these people at the Capitol are Al-Qaeda, then we need to focus on the environment in which they thrive, which means the American right. The American right, broadly defined, 150 million people, 170, are responsible for the Al-Qaeda size September 11th type catastrophe at the Capitol on January 6th. Is that how you remember it? 3,000 people slaughtered? Or one lady got crushed to death and one protester got shot by a cop and a cop had a heart attack later. Yeah, that's just like when Al-Qaeda attacked us, except that these are American civilians. There's a new story at foreignpolicy.com today saying we have to use our programs that we use for Islamic de-radicalization. We have to use that against QAnon and against Christian fundamentalists in America. Tens of millions of people count as evangelical Christians of one kind of Protestant denomination or another. These people must be de-radicalized, says foreignpolicy.com today. And Glenn Greenwald at substack.com has a new article about how some Congress people are upset because the Homeland Security Department just put out a report about what dangerous, violent extremists Americans are. Left-wingers, right-wingers, pro-abortion, anti-abortion, whatever you got. We're all in there. Earth first, right-wing gun owners, Black Panthers or Black Lives Matter types or right-wing militia guys from the 3%ers. All these violent extremists. And yet, according to the report, it was put together by the intelligence community, the CIA, and the Defense Intelligence Agency under the auspices of the Director for National Intelligence. But they're not supposed to have any authority to do any such thing. That's the job of the FBI Counterintelligence Division in domestic matters in the United States, not the CIA, to investigate American dissident groups. And even have Democrats in the Congress in the Greenwald piece today saying, what's going on here? And what's going on here is they lost 20 years of wars overseas, and so now they want to turn it all on us instead of just admitting that they're good for nothing and getting real jobs like everybody else.
Scott,
And so,
I'm jumping in because we're definitely running over, and that's like a perfect spot to open it up for some questions. So I hate to cut you off there.
okay, well, let me just say
Go
can I
ahead.
just,
Give a wrap up. Absolutely.
okay. Okay, so listen, the point of this is that, and as you can see with the new Cold Wars, the reinvigorated Cold Wars with Russia and China that are happening now, 50 years almost after Nixon ended the Cold War with China, and 30 years after the Soviet Union entirely ceased to exist, that this whole thing is a racket. And as Martin Luther King said back in 1968, the US government is the greatest purveyor of violence on the face of the earth. It is illegitimate and irresponsible power. They pretend that this is the selfless expansion of, expansion of American resources. Let me say it. In order to help people, to create a liberal world order and a rule of law for global capitalism and trade and freedom and democracy. But it's just not true. And all they do is threaten people and sanction people, which means deliberately starve civilians and bomb them if they don't comply. They've taken the writ that was given to George W. Bush by the American people to get bin Laden and the guilty for the September 11th attack, and they've killed upwards of 2 million innocent people, had nothing to do with it whatsoever, driven 37 million people out of their homes, which is the greatest refugee crisis since World War II. And so the lesson here is that we just have to stop it. There is no way for them to credibly argue that if we give them a little more time to tie up the loose ends and set everything just right, that then possibly they could withdraw in a way that would lead to a better circumstance. We see the small version of this argument in the case of Afghanistan right now. It's bogus. We just have to come home. We cannot trust these men to do it right, even if they meant to do the right thing and follow the law and attack the American people's actual enemies instead of their regional rivals. They're incompetent at best and criminals, guilty war criminals, more accurately. And so it is incumbent upon the American people, all of us, to simply refuse to accept the pretended legitimacy of this system of American global dominance. It's not arguable whether we should stay in Afghanistan a little bit longer or not. And anyone who says that it is should be completely shouted down now. The consensus of the American people now is, and even on the American right, as demonstrated by Donald Trump's statements and election on those statements in 2016, that they don't believe in the war anymore. And if the American right doesn't, if the American talk radio audiences don't believe in the wars anymore, then nobody does. And it's time for all of us to insist that they end now. So thank you.
Oh, that was very, very good. The question that everybody, at least in my mind, can't seem to fathom is, if like say as a good example, you were citing Ron Paul being in Congress, the bulk of the people, it seemed like they're in government that we all elect are just, trying to do the right thing, at least on the space of it. How do we suddenly have this bipolar world here where there's this other part of our government that seems like it's operating independent of everything else, doing all of what you just said? How did that genie get out of the bottle? And therefore, how can you possibly stop it? It seems like it's not under anyone's control.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's really the key to it. It's World War II. We never demobilized after World War II. And Senator Vandenberg told Harry Truman, go out there and scare the hell out of them, Harry, and make the American people believe that the Soviet Union that just lost between 30 and 40 million people in this war are prepared to conquer the whole planet Earth if we don't stop them. And they built up this massive world empire in the name of containing communism. And long before I was born, in January 1961, Ike Eisenhower, who was a 5-star general and, of course, the supreme allied commander of all United Nations forces in Europe in World War II and turned 2-term president of the United States, warned on his last day in office. It was too late for him to do anything about it, and too late really for us to do anything about it, that there exists now this new combine, this new system of power in America, the military industrial complex. And I was introduced to this term as a kid, really, in the 1980s. And it's kind of like, ooh, forbidden knowledge, secret conspiracy theory. But it was Ike Eisenhower who coined the phrase. You can't deny it. What does it mean? It means that the arms manufacturers are special interests. That they will lobby to pressure the government to continue the policies that make them necessary. If you don't need long-range bombers for Russia, then you need long-range bombers for Iraq. And if you don't need long-range bombers for Iraq, then you need them for Iran. If you don't need them for Iran, then you need them for China. And you need them for Russia again. And maybe we'll have to go find the lost continent of Atlantis so we can threaten them too. We have to have an enemy simply so that these relatively small firms, in comparison to the rest of the size of the American economy, they are the squeaky wheel and they get the grease. And it's a scandal in itself that you have a firm like Lockheed Martin, which is the most powerful of these firms, that can spend literally just $15 million a year, just an absolute pittance, on supporting the think tanks and paying the lawyers and the lobbyists and whining and dining the congressmen, buying them steak dinners and entertainment for the night, and to get their money made. And then they turn around and cash checks for literally hundreds of billions of dollars. And it's a racket. And of course, in the meantime, ever since 1961, when Ike Eisenhower said that, there's never been a reckoning. There never was a comeuppance at all. There's a little bit of reform of the CIA in the 70s, but not of the Pentagon ever. And since September 11th, there's been a lot of work done to show that whatever was the military industrial complex before has an exact mirror image now in the Homeland Security, domestic terrorism, industry as well. And all of the weapons that are given to all of the different sheriffs and police departments across the country and all of these things. It's what the military they call it themselves, a self-licking ice cream cone. That means they create their own crisis and their own excuses for their own further interventions and their own, further existence. And if there is a way to stop it, I think, in spirit, what it is for all the American people to just refuse to believe in it anymore. There's just no reason to. It's silly to believe in it. And we ought to laugh at our friends that do. Come on. Don't be such a fool. And I think we all know that the American government doesn't care what the American people think about anything. But war, they have to have some mass of the American population that supports the beginning of a war against a country. And if they don't have the American right, because liberals, they'll turn a blind eye to Barack Obama maybe, but they're not really for war, and leftists and progressives certainly are not imperialists in America. And so if the American right-wing AM talk radio audiences, if they just refuse to believe, like when Obama wanted to bomb Syria in 2013 over the fake chemical weapons hoax that August, then they can't do it. They can't do it. And I think that's really what it's going to take. And then we see the expression of this from the state level with the Defend the Guard legislation. And I just actually gave a speech to a committee of the Montana State Senate yesterday about a resolution they're passing demanding that Congress repeal the AUMF from the authorization to use military force from 2001. And there's this Defend the Guard legislation that's being sponsored in 30 states, and it's being introduced almost exclusively by Republicans, Ron Paul-leaning type Republicans, and in many, many cases, combat veterans of the Iraq and Afghan wars of our era are these state representatives who are introducing this legislation that says that Congress can't have our state guard troops unless they issue an official declaration of war, which of course they will never do. They haven't done since they declared war on Hungary in 1942, and would never take responsibility for starting a war. So that's a huge poison pill, that National Guard troops are for sandbags during floods and hoses during forest fires, and otherwise drinking beer, once, for 2 weeks a year and 1 weekend a month with their friends.
Very good, Scott. I'm going to take advantage of our audience here because I see hiding in here is Doug Bandow. I was going to see if maybe we can get a little feedback from him. He's in here from Cato Institute. Doug, are you available to chime in?
Mentor.
Well, I think Scott's done a good job. That I've enjoyed listening. So I'm happy to let him do the work. He's right on how this is all played out. It's an extraordinary story.
It's amazing. So definitely you need to turn it into a screenplay there, Scott. I got a hand up here. Let's squeeze in one good question because we're running up against our clock. David, I see your hand was up.
Thank you, Jeff. Scott, is it really just the neocon right? And what is the real purpose of the U.S. government pervasive use of false flag operations to dupe the rest of us, both neocons and progressives? What's their motivation? And what can we do about it?
Yeah. Well, on the right, it's certainly not just the neoconservatives. I mean, the broad base of the American right has supported this, and the conservative, Republican Party. And to be specific here, because people use neoconservative in different ways. I try to be very careful and use it strictly as a biographical definition. The real neoconservatives are the men that Jim Loeb writes about, and they are approximately 75 men maximum, and all of them related somehow to Gertrude Himmelfarb, and all of them almost all of them former followers of Leon Trotsky and that sect of leftist communist politics in the last century, who then moved right, became, essentially Reaganite, and also, of course, are extremely Zionist. But this is the Podhoritzes and the Crystals and the men from Jinsa, as Jason Vest put it in his Mother Jones piece. The neoconservatives in the Bush Jr. administration who lied us into war and so forth. And they're still around, of course, Max Boot and Elliot Abrams. They do a lot of writing. I don't think as far as I know, there's no literal neoconservatives in the Biden administration at the moment, but there could be. Elliot Abrams famously was extremely influential under Donald Trump. He was one of the original group there. But no, the broad base of the Republican Party in power has always been, extremely hawkish in my lifetime. The advent of Donald Trump's politics is really what did that. First of all, Ron Paul really got the ball rolling in 08 and 10 by saying, you don't have to be like Michael Moore to be anti-war. You could be like me, Republican congressman from Texas, a conservative old country doctor still married to his first wife, and all those wonderful things about Dr. Paul's character. I said, you don't have to believe in this stuff. I don't. And people just, wow, really? I don't? Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Paul. Changed my life. Millions, tens of millions of Americans, were turned by that. And we saw John McCain and Mitt Romney fail because they refused to disavow the Bush legacy. And then Donald Trump came and he was running against Jeb. So he really had no choice, but I think he always felt like this anyway. He was certainly right about it. It's indisputable that we should have never been over there at all. And of course, the way Donald Trump says everything is that was the worst decision any American president ever made, was to go over there. Generally speaking, we should have never had anything to do with it. And then so the challenge to the American right was, okay, so who do you choose? George W. Bush's legacy that you guys were willing to fight to the death over a few years ago, or the new guy? And the answer was, we like the new guy. And in fact, by then, after the rise of the Islamic State and the rest of this chaos, who could deny it? Who could argue that, the George Bush really knew what he was doing? It was, I don't know what, just Obama's fault that it didn't work out right or something like that. No one could believe that. Some, Republicans in power tried to argue that, but regular Joes didn't buy that. And combat veterans of those wars didn't buy that. So I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought here. God, I was thinking too far on that tangent.
That's right.
I'm sorry, the neoconservative right. And then, so as far as the progressives go, again, ever since Vietnam, I think, the best positive legacy of Vietnam is the liberals and even the liberals and the progressives, and certainly all of the socialists and leftists. They all still have Vietnam syndrome. They don't believe in these wars. They really don't. And, if you want to go to Washington, D.C., or if you show up at like a Samantha Power speech in your town and interview all the NPR ladies there or something, then maybe they'll come up with some excuses for it, like we're trying to help the people or whatever. But the broad base of the American left does not believe in this stuff, and essentially have to be drag kicking and screaming, or at least cajoled to kind of turn away. Now, one thing that is beneficial about Joe Biden is that he's no Barack Obama in terms of being charming and persuasive when, dealing with the mass of the people there. So you have a lot of people on the progressive left who are like, well, sure, he ain't Trump, but otherwise, kind of look at him from a cynical point of view and don't trust him. And so I think, it'd be a lot easier to chant, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today, than to make the same chant about JFK, right? And so I think that's the case here, where it should be easy. And you know what? This is what's so important right now for this moment for the American right, and especially, like I mentioned, those Republican state legislatures issuing this Defend the Guard legislation and all this. Because first of all, it's undermining the narrative that the American right, broadly speaking, in the country, the people support this stuff. But also, what a great talking point for the leftists and progressives to use against the liberals and the Democrats to say, listen, you are forbidden from being worse than, say, Rand Paul on this stuff. We will not tolerate having liberal Democrats support these wars while we have Republican state legislatures trying to stop them. And if you keep it up, we're going to stay home and you're going to lose. And for that matter, it's another great talking point for the liberals and the leftists that, look, if all these Republicans agree with us, then that's just the proof how right we are. Even all these right wingers don't believe in the war anymore. These former Bush supporters, now you can't get them to remember that they ever supported George W. Bush because of what a disaster it has all been. And so from a left-wing point of view, if even all these right-wingers from Doug Bondo at the Libertarian Cato Institute and everyone to the right of him even all agree, then the game is up. And that has to be the narrative is, you know, we don't care what the neoliberals or neoconservatives in New York and DC say. It's the 99.9999% of us against them.
What a great place to end it. A very good tempo and optimistic conclusion. So Scott, that was great. And I appreciate you being here today.
Thank you all very much for having me. I really appreciate it.